Classicists have started to draw on work in history and anthropology regarding emotions. These scholars recognize that we cannot get at the neurobiological and psychological processes lying behind these emotions, but they do suggest that we can study the external stimuli that prompt emotions. If, by comparison with the modern context, we view iconoclastic events as performances of a sort that are meant to prompt strong emotions in both people performing the actions and those experiencing them, then we can perhaps include iconoclastic acts among these external stimuli prompting emotions. We can look at what we might call ancient social media, or how performative events were broadcast then, inscriptions, speeches, new art plays, in order to establish how these actions affected the emotional community of Athens. And admittedly, we are particularly lucky that in the case of Athens, we do have these sorts of sources. One advantage of trying to study emotions is that we see beyond the practice of iconoclasm from the standpoint of the victors, as we often do, and instead consider the experience of the people who lived through these events. We also work towards towards writing what we call contingent histories. Regarding our case study, scholars often write the history of the Persian sack from the standpoint that the Acropolis that we know today will be built in 30 years. What if we remove that hindsight and focus on the experience of the event, much as we are forced to do now in writing about the events in Syria and Iraq, for which we do not yet know the ending? Then we focus on the uncertainty and why the Athenians decided to bury the hacked-up statues or leave the charred remains of buildings visible for years. Particularly since scholars have now determined that the Oath of Plataea, in which the Greeks supposedly vowed not to rebuild the temples destroyed by the Persian invasion, they've decided that this was not contemporary with these events. The door is open to these sort of approaches that focus on the event itself and its immediate aftermath. The difficulty is not responding and reproducing an Orientalist outlook. Think again, the 300 movies. Currently, a documentary approach to both the ancient and modern events can lead us towards framing the situation as the Eastern barbarians destroying the heritage of the West, as we touched upon in the response to the first panel. Potentially paying attention to the emotional context can help us avoid this phenomenon to an extent. For instance, regarding the Greek world, if we look at textual and archaeological evidence together and try to understand the emotional response within Greek society, then we can consider such questions as why were the Athenians particularly distressed by the destruction of the Acropolis, when the kidnapping of cult statues, burning of cities, and destroying of sanctuaries was a relatively common element of war and boundary disputes. The Greeks also perpetrated acts of iconoclasm against each other. Arguably then, the Athenian response had less to do with the art itself, where we today place the value, and more on the place attacked, potentially the temple burnt, and the timing of the attack. By focusing on these more specific elements, we can move away from the generalizing, polarizing Orientalist narratives, and also start to approach the past on its own terms, and not as an idealized progenitor of our modern society. In turn, as using the present to understand the past can help us focus on how emotions are involved in responding to iconoclastic events, we can return to questioning the present and interrogate why our emotional community responds more readily to certain iconoclastic events over others, and how we can harness these responses in responding to modern iconoclasm. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eliza. Thank you, Eliza, for really fascinating take on some of the questions we've been addressing. We have time for a question. Jason?
I think this is a really productive way of looking at this. How would a holistic look at a society and how they approach these acts of iconoclasm? I don't know the Greek case, but I can tell you that when I look at the Assyrian case, I wonder if there wouldn't have been an awful lot of sympathy for this iconoclasm on the part of the common people. The monuments that we see, Isis, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, blowing up, this is the second time they've been attacked. The Babylonians and the Medes took chunks out of these pieces. They didn't have the jackhammers, but almost all of the faces have been scarred from events in the late 7th century. Except I'm not certain that it was, in the case of the Assyrians, I'm not certain that it was the Babylonians and Medes that did this. It very well could have been the poorly treated populations of the Assyrian cities and empire that could have been responsible for this. So when I look at these things, I'm not actually certain that I can put myself into the mindset of the rest of the population here. And certainly if you look at the monuments of Saddam Hussein, if you go 200 years into the future, if you assume that it was the American army that smashed out all of these faces, you'd be completely wrong about that, although we did pull down a few statues. So I think this is a really productive way of looking at things, although I don't have faith in for my own case study, I don't have faith in my ability to actually see into the emotions of the people in the societies that I studied in the past.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, speaking to the broader question of sources that's debated in the literature about emotion in history. And classicists who are starting to move into this area have, I think, a privileged position in that, particularly when you're looking at Athens, we have a relatively good textual record. You're still dealing with the fact that that textual record is particularly indicative of how a certain subset of society was feeling. And so when scholars talk about emotional community, which is a term used broadly in the scholarship on emotion, I think any sort of detailed case study that goes beyond 10 minutes would have to take into account which portion of society you're looking at as this emotional community. I imagine the elites in Athens were responding very differently than your general citizen who's going about their daily life. And different Greeks in different places may have felt differently. This is the issue we deal with in any case study, though, of elite versus non-elite, female versus male. We can never sort of cover what everyone's thinking, what's happening to everyone. And so I don't think that it means we can't try.
Great. Thank you very much. Great. I think this discussion about the recursive relationship between iconoclastic performance and its audience is going to be particularly relevant for our next talk.